Good morning, everyone. It's September 17th. So, I've been talking about our origins and the Sumerians more and more as I learn more and more about them. And one of the things that leads me to believe the Sumerian version of our creation is 223 mystery genes. And I think probably that is reasonable scientific evidence that the Sumerian version is probably the accurate version. So it hasn't been very long since the scientific community was able to complete the decoding of the human genome, our entire DNA genetic makeup. And I think probably everybody knows what DNA is by now, but for those of you who don't, it is, in simplest terms, you can view it as two pearl necklaces twisted around each other. And each of the pearls on the necklace represent a gene. And these genes are responsible for every part of who and what we are. The genes decide the color of your hair, your eyes, how tall you are, and so on and so forth. Every part of your body can be traced back to the genes that came from your mother and your father. Your genes form the entire blueprint of your physical body. The DNA sequence of many other forms of life, both complex and simple, have been decoded as well. Scientists were eager to take the new information and compare our DNA code to the codes found in other life forms. And they wanted to get an idea of how humans evolved. And here are some of the surprising conclusions from that endeavor. A tiny fruit fly has 13,601 genes. We humans have a little more than 30,000 genes, not the 100,000 to 140,000 that the scientists had anticipated. There's not much uniqueness to human genes. Ours are the same as 99% of those found in chimpanzees and common to 70% found in mice. And of course, some of our genes are going to have many of the same functions. I mean, for example, a gene that makes your lungs work in a monkey or a chimpanzee would be one of the genes they're referring to, and other involuntary systems. So we have many of the same, human genes have many of the same functions as genes found in other living organisms, both complex and simple. All of the DNA information we now have leads to the conclusion that there was a common source for the DNA that has found its way into all living things on the planet. The more complex life forms evolved by adding on more and more of the available original genes, some of which have mutated. All of it supposedly culminated in Homo sapiens, us. However, here is the part that continues to baffle the best scientists in the world. There are 223 genes in our human DNA code that are not found in other living organisms. In other words, we did not inherit these genes from any other form of life on this planet. And this is what raises some very good questions. And in particular, where did they come from? The best our scientists can say is that they came from a sideways bacterial infection sometime in our remote past. Said in another way, those 223 genes were implanted all at once into our ancestors' DNA makeup by a bacterial infection. Now, do you really fucking believe that? That would mean that we are a result of a bacterial infection. But if we think outside the box and open up our mind, we can ask the question, is it possible that a race of advanced beings visited this planet thousands of years ago and inserted those 223 genes into our ancestors' DNA code? You might think it's funny, but it's not as far-fetched as one might think. Scientists are doing similar kinds of genetic manipulation experiments today. In addition, there is quite a bit of evidence supporting such a concept, and part of it can be found on the thousands of clay tablets left behind by the ancient Sumerians. For those who haven't done so already, consider reading the book by world-class scholar and linguist, by the way, Zecharia Sitchin, called Genesis Revisited. Now, a lot of people like to argue about Zecharia Sitchin's translations. However, I have read through other translations, and they are more or less the same. There's subtle differences in opinion, such as, let me think here, what did they call the minds? Man, it's right on the tip of my tongue. The Absu. Zecharia Sitchin thinks that Absu means minds, and others think it means something else. So the differences in the translations are minimal, meaning they agree on the overall content, but disagree on small nuances. Okay? So, in the case of Adam's alien genes by Zecharia Sitchin, in whose image was the Adam, the prototype of modern humans, Homo sapiens, created? The Bible asserts that the Elohim said, Let us fashion the atom in our image and after our likeness. But if one is to accept a tentative explanation for ignitic genes that humans possess, offered when the deciphering of the human genome was announced in mid-February, the feat was decided upon by a group of bacteria. Humbling was the prevalent adjective used by the scientific teams and the media to describe the principal finding, that the human genome contains not the anticipated 100,000 to 140,000 genes, but only some 30+ thousand, little more than double the 13,601 genes of a fruit fly, and barely 50% more than the roundworm's 19,098 genes. What a come down from the pinnacle of the genomic tree of life. Moreover, there was hardly any uniqueness to the human genes. They were comparative to the presumed 95%, but to almost 99% of the chimpanzees and 70% of the mouse. Human genes with the same functions were found to be identical to the genes of other vertebrates, as well as invertebrates, plants, fungus, and yeast. The finding not only confirmed that there was one source of DNA for all life on Earth, but it also enabled the scientists to trace the evolutionary process, how more complex organisms evolved genetically from simpler ones, adopting at each stage the genes of a lower life form to create a more complex higher life form, culminating with Homo sapiens. The head-scratching discovery. It was here in tracing the vertical evolutionary record contained in the human and other analyzed genomes that the scientists ran into an enigma. The head-scratching discovery by the public consortium, as scientists termed it, was that the human genome contains 223 genes that do not have the required predecessors on the genomic evolutionary tree. How did man acquire such a bunch of ignitic genes? In the evolution progression from bacteria to invertebrates, and finally modern humans, these 223 genes are completely missing in the invertebrate phase. Therefore, the scientists can explain their presence in the human genome by a rather recent, probable, horizontal transfer from bacteria. And I think that's a fucking insult. Bacteria. Not only is it an insult to us as humans, but it's also an insult to human intelligence. Because how likely is it that bacteria is going to possess those 223 genes all at one time and insert it into our genetic makeup all at the same time? In other words, at a relatively recent time, as evolution goes, modern humans acquired an extra 223 genes not through gradual evolution, not vertically on the tree of life, but horizontally, as a sideways insertion of genetic material from bacteria, an immense difference. Now, at first glance, it would seem that 223 genes is no big deal. In fact, while every single gene makes a great difference to every individual, 223 genes make an immense difference to a species such as ours. The human gene is made up of about 3 billion nucleotides, and these are the letters A, C, G, T, which stand for the initials of the 4 nucleic acids that spell out all life on Earth. Of them, just a little more than 1% are grouped into functioning genes. Each gene consists of thousands of letters. The difference between one individual person and another amounts to about 1 letter in 1,000 in the DNA alphabet. The difference between man and chimpanzees is less than 1% as genes go, and 1% of 30,000 genes is 300. So, 223 genes is more than 2/3 of the difference between me, you, and a chimpanzee. An analysis of the functions of these genes through the proteins that they spell out, conducted by the public consortium team and published in the journal Nature, shows that they include not only proteins involved in important physiological but also psychiatric functions. Moreover, they are responsible for important neurological enzymes that stem only from mitochondrial portions of the DNA, the so-called Eve DNA. But humankind inherited only through the mother line all the way back to a single Eve. That finding alone raises doubt regarding the bacterial insertion explanation, a shaky theory. How sure are the scientists that such important and complex genes such as an immense human advantage was obtained by us rather recently through the courtesy of infecting bacteria? They're sure about a lot of things before, like, I don't know, the Earth being round or flat. Scientists swore back in the day, at some point, that the Earth was flat, right? Or there's just numerous times that science has been totally fucking wrong. So, and not only that, but perhaps they wouldn't admit where these genes actually come from because of religious dogma and among other reasons. It is a jump that does not follow current evolutionary theory, said Stephen Shorer, director of mapping of the Human Genome Sequencing Center, Baylor College of Medicine. We did not identify a strongly preferred bacterial source for the putative horizontally transferred genes, states the report in Nature. So if they didn't identify any of these bacterial sources, how can they even say with any kind of certainty that this is correct? They can't. Why is it that the Sumerian tablets make a whole lot more sense than evolution, and particularly in humans, specifically in humans? So, anyway, I digress. Okay, where did I leave off here? Right. The public consortium team conducting a detailed search found that some 113 genes out of 223 are widespread among bacteria, though they are entirely absent even in vertebrates. An analysis of the proteins which the ignited genes express showed that out of 35 identified, only 10 had counterparts in vertebrates, ranging from cows to rodents to fish. 25 of the 35 were unique to humans. And the report says it is not clear whether the transfer was from bacteria to humans or from humans to bacteria. And I would be willing to argue that it was from human to bacteria. Science quoted Robert Watterson, co-director of Washington University's Genome Sequencing Center, as saying, "But if man gave those genes to bacteria, where did man acquire the genes to begin with?" The role of the Anunnaki. Readers of my book must be smiling by now, for they know the answer. They know that the biblical verses dealing with the fashioning of the atom are condensed renderings of much, much more detailed Sumerian and Akkadian text found inscribed on clay tablets, in which the role of the Elohim in Genesis is performed by the Anunnaki. And I don't like how they say it, but it's for those who from heaven to earth came. It just sounds better if you say those who from heaven came to earth. Anyway, as detailed in my books, beginning with the 12th planet, and even more so in Genesis Revisited and the Cosmic Code, the Anunnaki came to Earth some 450,000 years ago from the planet Nibiru, a member of our own solar system whose great orbit brings it to our part of the heavens once every 3,600 years. They came here in need of gold, and that's not the only thing they were mining here, by the way. They came here in need of gold with which to protect their dwindling atmosphere. Exhausted and in need of help in mining the gold, their chief scientist, Enki, suggested that they use their genetic knowledge to create a primitive worker, or create primitive workers. When the other leaders of the Anunnaki asked, "How can you create a new being?" he answered, the being that we need already exists. All that we have to do is put our mark on it. This was some 300,000 years ago. What he had in mind was to upgrade genetically the existing hominids who were already on Earth through evolution by adding some of the genes of the more advanced Anunnaki. That the Anunnaki, who could already travel in space 450,000 years ago, possessed the genomic science. And by the way, we have reached that same threshold now, is clear not only from the actual texts, but from numerous depictions in which the double helix of the DNA is rendered as entwined serpents. And we see that symbol used for medicine and healing to this day. When the leaders of the Anunnaki approved the project, Enki, with the help of Ninharsa, the chief medical officer of the Anunnaki, embarked on a process of genetic engineering by adding and combining genes of the Anunnaki with those of the already existing hominids. And there's something that should be noted, and that is most other animals on the planet don't experience a lot of the genetic flaws that we have. So, something to keep in mind there. But, after much trial and error, breathtakingly described and recorded in antiquity, a perfect model was attained. Ninharasa held him up and shouted, "My hands have made it." An ancient artist depicted the scene on a cylinder seal, and that, I suggest, is how we had come to possess the unique extra genes. Now, I had this opinion before I knew of this. I just happened to stumble across it. I did learn about the Anunnaki before, and it makes a lot more sense from the human standpoint than Darwin. And this is significant. And unless further scientific research can establish beyond any doubt that the only possible source of the extra genes are indeed bacteria, and unless it is then also determined that the infection, horizontal transfer, went from bacteria to man and not from man to bacteria, the only other available solution will be that offered by the Sumerian texts. I'm leaning towards the Sumerian text. I mean, these people went through a whole lot of trouble to put these texts on tablets that would last for a very, very long time. And the reason they did so is because they wanted people after them to know how we came to be. Anyway, thought I would share this with you. Hope everyone has a great day.